Everyone knows Augustus Caesar built Rome's golden age. The marble temples, the reformed Senate, the Pax Romana, they credit him with all of it. The brilliant general, the visionary emperor, the man who turned a republic into an empire. What they don't tell you is that for over 50 years, someone else was making the real decisions. She never held a title. She never commanded a legion. She never addressed the Senate. Roman law didn't allow it. She was a woman, and women in Rome didn't rule, except she did. And the way she did it, the methods, the patience, the absolute ruthlessness, makes every male emperor in Roman history look clumsy by comparison. Her name was Livia Drusilla, and the story they tell about her, loyal wife, gracious empress, serene matriarch, is one of the most successful cover stories in the history of civilization. Because behind that story is something Rome itself could barely admit. A woman who accumulated more wealth, more influence, and more political control than any emperor's wife before or after her. A woman who may have poisoned her way through an entire dynasty to keep that power. A woman whose fingerprints are on nearly every death that cleared the path for her son's throne. This is what they buried under the marble. To understand Livia, you need to understand the world she was born into. Rome in 58 BC was not the stable golden empire of Augustus's propaganda. It was a city tearing itself apart. Civil war was constant. Alliances shifted overnight. The men who held power one year were dead the next. And women in this world had two options: obey or disappear. Livia was born into a powerful family, the Claudins, one of Rome's oldest and most aristocratic bloodlines. She was educated, politically aware, and from childhood surrounded by men who understood that power wasn't given, it was taken. She married young. Her first husband was Tiberius Claudius Nero, a man who made the catastrophic mistake of choosing the wrong side in Rome's civil war. He backed Mark Antony against Octavian, the man who would become Augustus Caesar. And when Octavian won, Livia's family were marked. She was 19 years old, pregnant with her second child, and on the run. Forced to flee with her husband and infant son through the mountains, hunted by the soldiers of a man who would later become her husband. That detail matters. Livia didn't grow up protected. She grew up surviving. And survivors learn things that comfortable people never do. Here's what the history books present as romantic. Octavian saw Livia at a dinner party. He was immediately captivated. He divorced his pregnant wife within days. He forced Livia's husband to divorce her while she was 6 months pregnant with that second child. And he married her immediately. Rome was scandalized. Even by Roman standards, this was aggressive. His political opponents mocked him. His allies were nervous. But here's what nobody asks. What did Livia think? She had every reason to hate Octavian. He had destroyed her family's political standing. He had hunted her across Italy. His victory had erased everything her husband stood for. And yet, within months of meeting him, she was his wife. Within years, she was his closest advisor. Within decades, she was the most powerful woman in the history of the empire. That didn't happen by accident. That didn't happen because Octavian was charming. Livia saw what nobody else saw clearly enough to act on. Octavian was going to win everything, and the woman standing beside him when he did would have access to power that no Roman woman had ever touched. She didn't fall in love with Octavian. She made a strategic decision that would take 50 years to fully execute, and she never deviated from it. Not once. Augustus trusted Livia completely. He consulted her on political matters. He read her letters before state correspondence. He sought her opinion on appointments, on laws, on enemies. This was radical. Roman men did not treat their wives as political partners. Roman tradition was explicit. Women managed households. Men managed empires. Augustus broke that tradition every day for 50 years, and Livia understood exactly how to use that access without ever appearing to use it. She never argued with him publicly. She never contradicted him in front of others. She maintained the image of the perfect Roman matriarch, modest, devoted, invisible in the way Roman society demanded of women. But in private, she was the emperor's brain trust. Augustus himself wrote about it. He kept notes on important conversations with Livia, scripted in advance so he wouldn't be caught off guard. He prepared his arguments for her like a lawyer preparing for the most demanding judge in Rome. Think about what that means. The most powerful man in the world rehearsed his conversations with his wife. She had built a dynamic where her approval carried more weight than the Senate's, where her silence on a matter was a veto, where her support was the thing every ambitious Roman needed, and her opposition was a death sentence, sometimes literally. Here's the part that gets buried in every biography of Livia, the part that historians mention briefly and then move past as though it's a footnote. Livia Drusilla was extraordinarily, incomprehensibly wealthy. On her own, independently, not through Augustus, through herself. At the height of her power, she owned papyrus plantations in Egypt, the papyrus that Rome used for all its written records, all its correspondence, all its literature. She controlled the supply of the material that ran the empire's administrative machine. She owned brick factories, the bricks that built Augustan Rome, the monuments, the temples, the aqueducts, the homes of senators and merchants. Many of them bore her stamp. Literally, her name stamped into the clay before firing. Livia's bricks are still being found in archaeological digs across the former Roman Empire today. She owned vineyards in Italy and estates across multiple provinces. She controlled fish ponds, a luxury food source that wealthy Romans treated as status symbols. She had vast land holdings throughout the empire that generated income independent of anything connected to Augustus, and she managed all of it herself with her own staff, her own financial administrators, her own legal representatives who handled her business interests across the empire. She was not a wealthy woman because she was the emperor's wife. She was a wealthy woman who was also the emperor's wife. And that distinction is everything, because wealth in Rome was power, not metaphorical power, actual, physical, operational power. It meant you could hire people. It meant you owed no one. It meant when politicians came to you for support, financial support, political backing, access to the emperor, you were the one deciding yes or no. Livia had her own network of clients, politicians, military men, freedmen in key administrative positions, all of them in her debt, all of them tied to her wealth, her patronage, her protection. She had built a parallel power structure inside the most powerful empire on earth, and it was invisible because it was hers and hers alone. But all of that wealth and all of that influence was built on one foundation, her position as Augustus's wife. And that position was only secure as long as one thing remained true. Augustus needed her. The problem was succession. Augustus had no male heirs from Livia. The couple had no children together. And Augustus had only one biological child, a daughter named Julia from his previous marriage. Roman succession required a male heir. An emperor needed a son to inherit, and the line of succession became the most dangerous game in Roman history, because every candidate who emerged had a way of dying before they could take the throne. This is where history gets uncomfortable. Augustus's nephew, Marcellus, his first choice as heir, died young, unexpectedly. The cause was listed as illness. Then Agrippa, his trusted general and son-in-law, died. Also illness, also unexpected. Then Gaius Caesar, Augustus's adopted grandson, the young man Rome had celebrated as the future of the empire, the heir everyone expected, died on a military campaign. The official story was a wound that wouldn't heal. Then Lucius Caesar, his brother, also an adopted grandson of Augustus, died of illness less than 2 years after Gaius. In 14 years, 4 heirs to Augustus Caesar died. 4 young, healthy men who stood between Livia's son Tiberius and the throne of Rome. And Tiberius became emperor. Coincidence is possible. Disease was common in the ancient world. Military wounds killed young men. Augustus was aging, and the question of succession created natural pressure. But Rome itself didn't believe in coincidence. Roman historians documented the suspicion openly. Tacitus wrote that Livia's maternal devotion and her stepchildren's deaths were talked about in the same breath, not as a smear, but as a political reality that Rome accepted and feared simultaneously. The woman who had survived being hunted across Italy, the woman who had turned her enemy into her husband, the woman who had built a financial empire inside the political one. Did anyone seriously believe she would let chance determine her son's future? Now here's where it gets specific. And specific is where history becomes something you can't look away from. Livia had access to something that most people in Rome didn't. Gardens. Extraordinary, carefully cultivated gardens at her villa on the Palatine Hill and at her estate outside Rome. These weren't decorative. They were pharmaceutical. She cultivated plants from across the empire, maintained by specialists who understood botanical chemistry in ways that Rome's physicians documented and feared. She was known for her knowledge of herbs, of medicinal plants, of the properties of growing things. In Rome, this kind of knowledge had two applications: healing and killing. The line between them was a question of dosage. The ancient sources describe Augustus's sudden illness as beginning after eating figs. Not just any figs, figs from his own garden, picked fresh from the tree, figs that Livia had tended personally. Augustus died in 14 AD. He was 75 years old. His health had been declining. An old man dying of natural causes was entirely plausible, but Livia had ensured that at the moment of his death, the succession documentation was complete. The military commanders were aligned. The Senate had been prepared, and Tiberius, her son, was positioned to assume power without a single day of uncertainty. The timing was not an accident. And after Augustus died, after Rome mourned its emperor, something extraordinary happened. His will was read publicly before the Senate, and in that will, Augustus had adopted Livia formally into the Julian family, the imperial bloodline. He had given her a new name, Julia Augusta. He had left her 1/3 of his estate. He had elevated her to a legal status that no Roman woman had ever held. And he had done all of this while dying in his final days, with Livia managing everything around him. The last act of Augustus Caesar's reign was to hand Livia Drusilla the keys. Tiberius became emperor. Livia's son, the boy she had protected, positioned, and guided for decades, finally wore the purple. And immediately, the power struggle began. Because Tiberius was not a puppet. He was intelligent, experienced, and deeply, furiously resentful of his mother. He had spent his entire life in her shadow. He had watched her maneuver and manipulate and control. He understood exactly what she was. And he didn't want a co-emperor, especially not his mother. But Livia didn't behave like a retired empress. She behaved like the senior partner in an arrangement Tiberius hadn't agreed to. She received citizens who brought her petitions, the same way a ruler receives subjects. She expected her name to appear alongside Tiberius's on official documents. She expected the title Mater Patriae, Mother of the Fatherland. She expected, in short, formal recognition of the power she had already been exercising informally for 50 years. Tiberius refused every request, every suggestion, every title. He blocked it. He limited her public appearances. He undermined her patronage networks. He countermanded her political recommendations. He was trying to do to her exactly what she had spent decades doing to everyone else: control the access, cut the connections, reduce the influence until the person was isolated and powerless. He almost succeeded, because Livia had one weapon Tiberius could not neutralize. She knew everything. She had kept records, letters, correspondence, documentation of every favor asked and granted, every secret told in confidence, every compromise made by men who thought they were safe behind closed palace doors. She had 50 years of Roman political history stored in her memory and her archives, and Tiberius knew it. There is a documented moment, Tacitus records it, when Livia threatened to publish letters that Augustus had written to her about Tiberius. Letters, apparently, in which Augustus expressed serious doubts about his stepson's character. Letters that would have destroyed Tiberius's carefully constructed public image as Augustus's chosen successor. Tiberius backed down. The titles were denied, but the interference continued, because what choice did he have? You cannot outmaneuver a woman who has been playing this game longer than you've been alive. Livia lived to be 86 years old. In a world where most people died before 50, in a city where powerful women were particular targets for political elimination, she survived 9 decades. She outlived 4 of Augustus's heirs. She outlived Augustus himself. She survived the transition from republic to empire. She watched Rome transform around her, and she remained constant, embedded, essential. In her final years, the conflict with Tiberius deepened. He left Rome for the island of Capri, ostensibly a personal retreat, but functionally an abandonment of the capital. Some historians believe he left specifically to escape his mother's proximity, to govern at a distance where she couldn't appear in his room unannounced. When Livia fell seriously ill, Tiberius did not return to Rome. He stayed on Capri. He sent a letter. His mother, who had made him emperor, was dying, and her son, the most powerful man in the world, couldn't be bothered to make the journey. She died in 29 AD. She was 86 years old. She had been politically active until the very end. Tiberius did not attend her funeral. He cited pressing business. He did not authorize divine honors, the deification that Roman tradition extended to emperors and their families. He delayed her burial. He blocked the execution of her will. This was not grief. This was not indifference. This was an emperor trying to erase his mother from history before the dirt had even settled. He failed. Because Livia had understood something Tiberius never did. You don't preserve power through titles. You don't secure a legacy through official documents. You preserve it through what you build that outlasts you. The freedmen she had freed and elevated held positions throughout the imperial administration for decades after her death. Her financial networks continued operating. The civic works she had funded, temples, porticos, public buildings in her name, stood in the city for centuries. The bricks, stamped with her name, were in the walls of buildings all across the empire. She had built herself into the physical structure of Rome. You couldn't erase her without tearing down the city. Here is the thing that makes Livia's story different from every other story of power in ancient Rome. Rome knew, not everything, not provably, but Rome knew what kind of woman she was. The historians who documented her life, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, they weren't writing in secret. They were writing for Roman audiences who already understood the subtext. When Tacitus describes her as a mother fatally indulgent to her son and overpowering to the state, he is not being subtle. When Suetonius says Augustus praised her publicly but complained privately that she was a difficult woman, he is not writing satire. When Cassius Dio calls her the most powerful of all women in the world, he is not offering a compliment. He is issuing a warning. Rome knew. Rome accepted it. Rome filed it in the category of things that were true but could not be said directly, because saying it directly would have required admitting that their entire system had been quietly managed by a woman for half a century. The propaganda of Augustan Rome was built on traditional values, Roman virtue, male authority, the proper order of civilization. And at the center of all that marble and ideology sat Livia, running the finances, managing the succession, eliminating obstacles, and presenting the perfect image of a modest Roman wife. It was the most sophisticated deception in the ancient world, and it worked completely. We have to address it directly, because it hangs over everything. Did Livia poison people? The ancient sources say yes, not as accusation, as established history that Roman audiences accepted. The deaths of Augustus's heirs, the timing of Augustus's own death, the convenient removals of political rivals who threatened her position, Rome believed she was responsible for most of them. Modern historians are more cautious. Disease was real, infant and young adult mortality was high. The ancient sources had their own biases and political motivations. But here's what we know with certainty. Livia had the access. She had the knowledge, she had the motive, and she had the results. Every single death that advanced Tiberius's claim to the throne happened. Every obstacle between her son and power was removed, whether by illness, by accident, by poison, by political maneuver, or by the grinding patience of a woman who understood that if you wait long enough, the right person always makes a fatal mistake. The obstacles disappeared. There is a name for someone who consistently achieves exactly the outcomes they need, through methods that can never quite be proven. In modern organizations, we call them operators. In Rome, they called her Augusta, and Rome was afraid of her. The senators who bowed to her, the emperors who tried to contain her, the historians who documented her with that particular combination of awe and terror that people reserve for forces they cannot fully understand. All of them afraid, not of what she might do, of what she had already done and would never admit to. Claudius deified her. The emperor who came after Tiberius, Livia's grandson, gave her what Tiberius had refused: divine status, official veneration, temples, her image on coins. He understood something Tiberius had not. You don't fight legacies, you inherit them. Livia became Diva Augusta, a goddess, the divine ancestor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The woman who had operated in shadows was immortalized in marble and gold across the empire. And somewhere in the official ideology of her deification, in the temples, in the priesthood established in her honor, in the coins that circulated through the empire's economy bearing her face, Rome finally admitted what it had always known. She had been running things all along, not as emperor, not with a title, but in the places where the real decisions happened, in private conversations, in financial arrangements, in the careful management of who lived and who didn't, and who stood beside power when the throne was finally passed. That was Livia's empire, built not in marble, but in influence, not in law, but in access, not in war, but in patience, and it lasted longer than most armies. They buried the real story under the official one, the devoted wife, the serene matriarch, the mother who sacrificed everything for her son. But if you know where to look, in the archives of her brick factories, in the records of her estates, in the correspondence she kept and weaponized, in the deaths that cleared every path she needed cleared, you see something different. You see a woman born into chaos who decided that the only way to survive was to become indispensable to the most dangerous man alive, and then to become more dangerous than him. You see a woman who built her own financial empire inside a political one and used it to create obligations that even emperors couldn't refuse. You see a woman who may have killed 4 of Rome's heirs and one of its greatest emperors, left no proof, lived to be 86 years old, and died in her own bed. That's not the story of a devoted wife. That's the story of the most successful power player in the history of the ancient world. And she did it in a society that told her she wasn't allowed to have power at all. Cleopatra chose the snake because death was the only choice Rome couldn't take from her. Livia made a different choice. She took everything else instead. And if you understand that, if you understand what it took, what it cost, what she was willing to do and to become, then you understand what Rome really was. Not the marble, not the law, not the Senate and the legions. Rome was whoever was willing to go furthest to hold it. And for 50 years, that was her. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden stories of power, money, and history's most dangerous figures, subscribe now, because behind every empire, every fortune, and every legend, there's a story they never wanted you to know.